Welcome to Can We Talk About It? We've got a special on today on science in the Qur'an, and we've got a specialist, Jonathan McClatchy. Now, you are a scientist, are you not?
Yeah, I have 2 master's degrees. I've one in evolutionary biology and one in medical and molecular bioscience, and I'm also currently doing a PhD.
Wow, so you really know science. You're the science guy. You're the go-to guy when it comes to science. What we're going to do today is we're going to unpack some of the claims that Muslims make concerning science in this book, the Qur'an. Now, you have looked at this book. You have looked at some of those claims. Give me an overview of your reaction to what you're hearing them say.
Yeah, and I've listened to many Muslims who have converted to Islam from Christianity or some other worldview persuasion, and typically one of the main apologetics that they will offer for why they converted to Islam are these so-called scientific insights in the Qur'an. And they give many examples, and they try to argue that this could only have been the product of divine inspiration and couldn't have been the work of a human being, that someone living in the 7th century AD, like Muhammad, who was purportedly illiterate and so forth, who predated the scientific revolution, how could he possibly have known these things way back then? And so that's typically an argument that they make. And when I read the Qur'an...
Are you convinced?
I'm not convinced. When I read the Qur'an, I see all of, in fact, the arguments that Muslims offer in support of this contention. Either the text doesn't say what they say it says, or they've over-exaggerated, or the Quran just simply gets it wrong, and it's far from a scientific miracle. It's more of a scientific blunder. And
so really, there are 3 things that you have found that it's not really what the Quran is saying.
Right.
They exaggerate what is there,
yeah.
And the Quran is just completely wrong.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite an indictment against the Quran. What we're going to do, John, is we're going to look at some of these examples. But your overview is there's a problem here.
Yeah, there's a real problem.
Now, before we even get into some examples, why do you think Muslims are so concerned with finding scientific discoveries in the Quran? What's the reason do you think is going on?
Well, in our modern Western world, we're often asked by skeptics, why do you believe what you believe? And so they're looking to try and clutch at something that they can use to justify their belief in Islam. And the scientific miracles is one argument that they've latched onto.
This is very popular. Yusuf Qaradawi in Al Jazeera television. This is one of his favorite programs every night. He unpacks these supposed, as you would say, scientific miracles. We're going to do that. We're going to look at some of these supposed scientific miracles. Join us. Come with us as we now unpack these different supposed miracles, and we're going to have a scientist look at them and tell you his impression with each one. John, it's so good to have you back. We're going to now look at some of these examples that we talked about. Let's look at the embryological cycle. This is a common one that we hear all over the world, that there are these 4 stages of the embryological cycle that only somebody today with a microscope could have known about. How could a prophet or someone with no scientific knowledge, he could even read and write, how could he have known something that specific, that particular, in the 7th century? Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, if you read the Qur'an and you read Surah Al-Mu'minun, which is the 23rd chapter of the Qur'an, verses 12 to 14, and we created...
Let's do that again. Chapter 23, verse 12 to 14 is where it is first listed. Go ahead.
Yeah. And we read there, we created man from an extract of clay. Then we made him as a drop in a place of settlement firmly fixed.
Nectar out of clay, drop.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Then we made the drop into an alaka. Then we made the alaka into a mugga, which means chewed substance.
Okay.
And so the word alaka can mean leech, it can mean suspended thing, or it can mean blood clot. And so basically, what Muslims have argued is they typically make these drawings of the embryo looking somewhat like a leech or something like that. There's a popular Islamic apologetics book called A Brief Illustrated Guide to Understanding Islam, and they have a leech which is compared with the human embryo. I think the drawings are highly exaggerated. I don't think it really looks like that. They also show a piece of chewed gum with tooth marks that resemble somites, and that the embryo will be a pharyngula stage embryo, and they will try to show a resemblance there, but really it's just the chewed gum has been manipulated to look like the human embryo when really there is no resemblance at all. It's really clutching its straws, I think, to make that type of argument.
Let me ask you, how big are when we're talking about the alaka stage, that's the second stage. The first stage is the zygote stage. Now that you cannot observe with the human eye.
Well, no, the pharyngula stage is like the mid stage. This is speaking about vertebrate embryos in particular. The pharyngula stage is this highly conserved phylotypic stage, at which vertebrate embryos are more similar than they are at
Is that
earlier
visible
stages.
to the naked eye?
No,
When a woman has a miscarriage,
no.
you cannot. So it is too small for the naked eye to
Correct.
see that state. So they would have a pretty good argument if someone in the 7th century can observe something that's not visible to the naked eye. How did he know, even whether or not it is using gum or any other object? How would he have known that particular that early without a microscope?
Well, I don't think he did. I mean, I think the idea of a piece of chewed gum is really just clutching at straws. I mean, to refute the argument, all you have to do is look at the diagrams and see how they've manipulated those images to make it look as much like an embryo as they possibly can. You know, the tooth marks in the embryo in this particular book, A Brief Illustrated Guide to Understanding Islam, are positioned just at the right place to resemble
so you're saying
somites.
these are modern facsimiles that they've created out of gum or whatever
Yeah.
today to try to explain what Muhammad would have written in the 7th century.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask you something else. Is there any other source that maybe whoever wrote the Qur'an, whether it's Muhammad or other, he couldn't read or write, but whoever wrote it down, is there another source they could have gotten those stages from?
Well, I don't think that these stages really resemble modern embryology as Muslims contend. So I don't.
So where do you think they do resemble? Where do you think that they got that embryological cycle from? They meaning the ones who wrote the Quran.
I don't know.
Let me give you a hint. How about Galen? Do you know Galen?
I'm not familiar with that.
Galen is actually an embryologist who is a Jewish embryologist writing in the 2nd century. He talks about the exact same 4 stages that you just read about in Surah 23. The zygote stage, followed by the alaka stage. He doesn't use the word alaka, he says chewed mass. Alaka is the Arabic for that description.
Right.
Followed by the bone stage, followed by the flesh stage. The exact same 4 stages you find in the Quran are found in Galen's writing from the 2nd century, used in Ctesiphon. It was well known that this is what was taught in what is today Baghdad. Ctesiphon is the archaic name for Baghdad. So Baghdad's not too far away from where Islam began. In fact, what we now know is the Quran was put together more than likely in Damascus and in Baghdad. It stands to reason that they were borrowing what was already there. But there's a problem. Now, you're not an embryologist, but you're a cell biologist. You know that whether or not it was zygote going up to the alaka, going up to the bones, going up to the meat. Do the bones form before the flesh?
No, they don't.
They form simultaneously, don't they?
Yeah.
So even Galen made a mistake. That mistake is incorporated into the Quran.
Yeah, exactly.
Modern biologists know that, and they say, hold on a minute, we don't use Galen anymore because of that mistake. Why did the Quran use that? Well, obviously because they were borrowing. And when you borrow, you don't really think through, or you don't even know whether or not this is a mistake. We now know it's a mistake today. So there's one example of borrowing. There's another example of using modern chewing gum, is one case, of trying to make it look like taking a word alaka without realizing this is all from Galen. But where did Galen get this from? How did he know about the zygote? How did he know about the chewed mass? Since he didn't have microscopes even in the 2nd century. Ooh, I love this.
Yeah.
But it even goes further back than that. Because we also know that the Greeks knew about the different stages. We have Aristotle talking about 15 stages of the embryo. How did Aristotle know this? He was writing in the 4th century BC. Ooh, I love this. So there's nothing new under the sun. This has all been borrowed from other sources. Listen, thanks so much. This is great. That's the first one. We're now going to look at some other scientific proofs. Stay tuned. We'll come right back. Welcome back. We're back with John McClatchy, our science guy, go to science, and he's not only because he is from a scientific background, looking at these proofs or supposed proofs of science in the Quran. We want to look at now Surah 31, Ayah 10, about mountains placed as tent pegs to keep the earth from shaking. Go ahead, John, and read that verse for us.
Sure, in Surah 31:10, we read, He has created the heavens without any pillars that you see, and has set on the earth firm mountains, lest it should shake with you. And He has scattered therein moving living creatures of all kinds. And we send down water from the sky, and we cause plants of every good kind to grow therein.
Okay, the first part of that verse is what we're going to look at today. He sets mountains as tent pegs. That means going into the earth to keep the earth from shaking. Help us here. Here's mountains right behind this. They're pretty big. I imagine there are roots that go way deep in the earth. That would make sense as someone who's not a scientific person. I believe that. Help me here. Isn't that true?
Yeah, Muslims make this argument, but I think it's better. I think these mountains are better understood as being placed on the earth according to what the Quran is saying as paperweights to keep the earth in place. I mean, mountains are actually produced at points of instability. So it's
just the opposite.
Yeah, it's just the opposite of what Muslims want to contend.
Now listen, I grew up in a mountain called the Himalayas, the world's largest mountains, and they're still growing. The tectonic plate of India is bashing up against the Tibetan tectonic plate, and as they collide, they cause a wrinkle. And as the wrinkle forms, the mountains get higher and higher and higher. The two collisions. Living there, we would go out into the mountains and we would see parts of the sea floor. We would see crustaceans from the sea right there at 10,000 feet up, proving that it used to be the sea floor that's been pushed up, which means it looks like it's just the opposite.
Yeah, just the opposite.
Help me here. The Quran says they're placed from on top, bang, into it to keep the earth from shaking.
Right, and yet we know that they're produced through plate tectonics, and it's produced at points of instability, and so it's just the opposite of what the Quran is claiming. So the Quran is simply wrong at this point.
In fact, we've just heard a few weeks ago of huge earthquakes happening in Nepal. Those earthquakes came about by the mountains still big growing.
Right.
Did you know the Himalayan mountains are still growing?
Yeah.
You know how fast they grow?
How fast?
The length of a fingernail every year.
Wow.
That's it. So it's not really that easily observable, but it seems to suggest that it's just the opposite from what the Quran's saying.
Right.
In fact, I would suggest this is an error, isn't it?
Yeah, and we know that mountains are not placed upon the earth, but they're actually produced from within the earth. And so, yes, it's just a scientific blunder rather than a scientific miracle.
What about tent pegs? Because tent pegs suggest that it's going deep, deep, deep down into the earth.
Well, it still suggests that they're placed onto the earth. So, the mountains are not stamped into the earth like a tent peg would be stamped into the earth, but they're actually produced through plate tectonics and mechanisms that we're familiar with.
In fact, there's no pegs at all, is it?
Right.
They're coming up.
Yeah, exactly.
It's magma underneath.
Yeah.
Magma is liquid. Nothing like a peg.
Yeah,
It's just the opposite. And every once in a while, that magma does come to the surface and we get a volcano.
Yeah.
So most mountains are very unstable. Maybe that's the better word to use. Thank you. This is helpful. We're not only finding that they've got the wrong material, looking at the wrong thing. I would suggest that this is what pre-scientific or unscientific people observing, like I just did, something big and large, that's how they would conclude. We now know through tectonic scientific forensic testing that it's just the opposite. The Quran actually is in error here. Not a scientific proof, is it?
No, not at all.
Thank you, John. That's great. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back again. This is Jay Smith, and we have John McClatchy here from Scotland, though you're in Northern England at the moment. But we're talking about looking at some of the scientific supposed proofs of the Quran, and we're finding these really aren't proofs. In fact, if anything, these are foibles. And we want to look at some of these foibles, some of these errors that are in the Quran. Help me here. Give me some examples of some errors that you have found.
So in Surah 18, for example, Surah Al-Kahf, which is in verse 86, we read about the kind of dual...
Let me read it, and then we'll go ahead and unpack it. This is what it says. Until when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting in a spring of black, muddy water, and he found near it a people. Okay?
Right, and so this account concerns a man called Qur'an in the Qur'an. And who's Qur'an? Well, Quranic commentators differ on this, but most Quranic commentators, there's a general consensus that it's Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great.
And according to this passage, this verse in verse 86, he travels so far west that he finds the setting place of the sun and finds it setting into a pool of muddy water, murky water, and finds there's the people living nearby. And we, of course, know that there isn't actually a place where the sun sets. I mean, an Islamic response might be that it's just using the language of appearance, and how it's setting into the water, and it was just a nice sunset. But it actually says there was a people living nearby where the sun set. And we know, of course, that just doesn't happen.
Now, let me just carry on from that. He then runs to the east.
Yeah.
Actually, he then runs to the east and sees it coming out.
Yeah.
So, and the people are burned by the sun. They're so close they get burned by the sun.
Yeah.
And then he runs to the north, and he sees a big wall made out of iron and brass from mountain to mountain. Now, let me think. Alexander the Great lived in 3rd century BC.
Yeah.
A wall that would keep an entire army out from one mountain to the other. There's a mountain there. We have a huge valley in between. A wall that tall, made out of iron and brass, don't you think someone would have observed it?
I would have thought so, yeah.
That would have been one of the greatest wonders of the world, of the ancient world, if anybody could build a wall out of iron and brass in the 3rd century BC. Why is it no one noticed it?
I don't know. Maybe the Quran was just wrong.
You've got some real problems in this story of Dual Qur'an.
Right.
But I love that one. Setting in the water, muddy water, obviously it's pre-scientific. This is nothing more than a fable.
Exactly.
We know where that comes from. Do you know where that is sourced?
Where is that sourced?
It's actually sourced by Heraclius. This is a tract Heraclius wrote in 630 AD about himself.
Wow.
When he defeated the Persians. He says, remember Dual Qur'an, remember Alexander the Great. 900 years ago. He talked about this great man who went to the west and he went to the east. He saw the sun set in the water. He saw it rise up. He came to the people who were being attacked by these evil people from across the mountain. And so he built up this wall to protect these people. But he said there will be a man coming who will defeat those people from across the mountains.
Right.
I am he.
Right.
Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor. He wrote it as a tract for himself. That finds its way into Surah 18.
Yeah.
It's nothing more than a tract, a political tract.
And you can look at some of the Hadith sources to see how the early Muslims actually interpreted those texts. And so you can look, for example, you can look at another verse, for example, which is in Surah Yasin, or verse 36, verses 38 through 40. Says, and the sun is quickly proceeding towards its destination.
Let me go ahead and read it right out of the
go
Quran
ahead.
itself. And the sun runs on its fixed course for a term. That is the decree of Almighty, the All-Knowing. And the moon we have measured for its mansions till it returns like an old, dry, curved date stalk. It is not for the sun to overtake the moon, nor does the night outstrip the day. They all float each in an orbit.
And so here you're dealing with a cumulative case for the understanding of the author of the Quran as to the relationship between the trajectories of the sun and moon and the earth. And so it seems that the author of the Quran actually thinks that the sun and moon are moving in relation to the earth, because it says that that they can't overtake each other in this. And in fact,
so back up. What you're telling me, it's pretty obvious from the text. The earth is the center of the universe.
Right.
These are going around the earth.
Right, these are going around the earth. And you can look at as I mentioned, you can look at the Hadith sources to find out how the early Muslims interpreted those verses. So in the case of the Surah 18 verse 86 one about Dual Qur'an, we read in Sunan Abu Dawud that Abu Dar said, I was sitting behind the Apostle of Allah, who was riding a donkey while the sun was setting. He asked, do you know where the sun sets? I replied, Allah and his Apostle know best. He says, it sets in a spring of warm water. And so it's clearly that there's actually a physical location in the early Islamic understanding, the understanding of the early generation Muslims as to where the sun actually sets. And if you read in Sahih Bukhari, which of course is the most authoritative hadith collection for Sunni Muslims,
Sahih,
yeah, Sahih, it's one of the Sahih hadith. We read, this is in volume 4, book 54, chapter 4, number 421. Narrated Abu Dar, the Prophet asked me at sunset, do you know where the sun goes at the time of sunset? I replied, Allah and his Apostle know better. He said, it goes till it prostrates itself underneath the throne and takes the permission to rise again. And it is permitted, and then a time will come when it will be about to prostrate itself, but its prostration will not be accepted. And it will ask permission to go on its course, but it will not be permitted. But it will be ordered to return when it has come, and so it will rise in the west. And that is the interpretation of the statement of Allah, and the sun runs its fixed course for a time decree. That is the decree of Allah, the Exalted in might, the All-Knowing. And so it's very clear how the early generation Muslims understood those verses in a very literal way.
That with chapter 36, Surah 36, it's obviously from what you've just told me, from both Dawood and Bukhari, it's the sun that does the moving.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the sun that gets the permission.
Right.
It's the sun that actually goes into the water and comes up out of the water.
Right.
And the earth is the one that sits still.
Right.
Whoa, you got a real problem here.
Yeah, real problem.
But pre-scientific man would have thought this. We do know that pre-scientific man thought that the earth was the center and everything went around it, one chasing the other, as it says here.
But Allah certainly wouldn't have thought like that.
No, not if this is really from God.
Right, exactly.
It would not have made that mistake. That's great, John. Thank you so much. This has been terrific. We'll look at some other material. Stay with us. We're still going to unpack a few of these scientific problems. Good to have you. Hi, we're back again. I'm with John McClatchy, the science guy. We're looking at some of the scientific problems. And one of the ones that comes up all the time is the whole production of semen in the Qur'an. Help me with this one, because this is a real problem, isn't it?
Right, so if you open up your Qur'an and go to Surah 86, verses 5 through 7, you want to...
Let me read it here for you. Surah 86, verses 5 to 7 says, "So let man see from what he is created. He is created from a water gushing forth, proceeding from between the backbone and the ribs." Ooh la la. Go ahead.
Well, semen, of course, isn't produced between the loins and the chest bones as the Qur'an contends. Rather, it's produced in the seminal vesicle behind the bladder. Sperm is produced in the testes, and the semen is produced in the seminal vesicle behind the bladder. And so the Qur'an...
So it's much further down,
it's much further
behind
down.
the bladder. That's where the semen is produced, not way up here between the backbone and the rib, which is halfway up your body. It's got the wrong location.
Right.
Oh, so we've got a real problem here. Now, as a science person, you would say this is a huge scientific error.
Yeah, this is another scientific blunder in the Qur'an.
Even if they want to say it's not the sperm as well, we're talking about both and are still further down.
Yeah.
And as you know, the sperm itself has to be in a sac outside the body.
Yeah, because it has to be kept to low core body temperature. Otherwise, it needs to be, otherwise it overheats at its body temperature.
If it was up here in the backbone, it would be too warm to begin with.
Yeah.
It could not even be created. So, the fact that it's created in the wrong place is an error.
Yeah.
Now, would God make a mistake like that?
No, Allah certainly would have known where semen and sperm are produced.
He certainly would have, and he wouldn't have let us get away with that. Again, just another one of these errors. The Quran proving it's nothing more than a book made by man, not from God. Well, this is our final chapter, looking at some of the scientific miracles, supposedly, and unpacking them and looking and seeing whether these really are miracles. John, our expert on science here, McClatchy from Edinburgh, but you're also, well, you are Scottish, but you are living in England at the time. You have already done 2 master's degrees, you're finishing up your doctorate in science, and you're very interested in these claims. Now, one of the things, probably one of the claims that has probably been the most exciting for me is this idea that there are these celestial bodies, these like asteroids or comets or meteors that shoot across the sky. You know, you can see them going right across the sky, and the Quran talks about this. Where do we find this in the Quran, and where are the problems you are having with these references?
Right, so if you read Surah 67, verse 5, that would be one
Let's
reference.
Just read that.
Yeah.
Verse 5 of chapter 67, "And indeed, we have adorned the nearest heaven with lamps, and we have made such lamps as missiles to drive away Shaitan," or devil. Shaitan would be the evil one, "and have prepared for them the torment of the blazing fire." Okay, so these are missiles to drive away the demons, or the jinn, or the Shaitan.
Right.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and also if you read in Surah 72, Surah Al-Jinn, verses 8 and 9, this surah is actually named after these jinn creatures.
You're right. Al-Jinn is the name of the surah. Verse 8 of Surah 72 says, "And we have sought to reach the heavens, but found it filled with stern guards and flaming fires. And verily, we used to sit there in stations to steal hearing, but any who listens now will find a flaming fire watching him in ambush." Okay, unpack that for us.
Yeah, and we can go to the early Muslim understanding from the Hadith traditions to find out how the early generation Muslims understood this. And we can read, for example, in Sahih Bukhari, again, most authoritative Hadith collection for Sunni Muslims. This is one of the Sahih Hadith. And we read in Sahih Bukhari, volume 4 and chapter 3, about the stars. Abu Qatada mentioned a last statement, "And we have adorned the nearest heaven with lamps," which comes from 67 verse 5, and said, "The creations of these stars is for three purposes, i.e. as decorations on the sky, as missiles to hit the devils, and as signs to guide travelers. So if anybody tries to find a different interpretation, he is mistaken and just wastes his efforts, and troubles himself with what is beyond his limited knowledge."
Well, I like the second one, as missiles to, say it again.
So the creation of these stars for three purposes is decorations on the sky,
Decorations.
and as missiles to hit the devils.
Missiles to chase the devil. Hold on a minute. So the devil is listening to the Qur'an being recited in heaven, and these missiles are there to chase them away. Now, help me here. Is that what meteors are?
No, they're not.
Do you find meteor showers?
The meteors are not stars. And so if the three purposes are, if the heavens has been adorned with lamps, and the creation of these stars is for the purpose of decoration of the sky, and as missiles to hit the devils and as signs to guide travelers, this is talking about stars, which are not the same thing as meteors.
Meteorites are just nothing more than pieces of rock.
Yeah, exactly.
Coming into our atmosphere and burning up in the atmosphere. Now, we know that today. But pre-scientific man looking at that may think, oh, those are stars zipping across the sky to chase away the devil. That's fascinating. So it's a great story. It's terrific imagination, but it's absolutely scientifically wrong, isn't it?
Exactly.
But it's entertaining nonetheless.
It's entertaining. Yeah.
You can
It's
understand.
good bedtime reading.
It's good bedtime reading. But it kind of pretty well proves that much of this is made up of rumor. Much of this is made up of traditions that have been passed down through the ages, borrowed from many other sources. I don't know if you've been noticing through all these different stories that we're talking about, the reference to the embryological cycle. We didn't even get into the hydrological cycle. We didn't get into even the different waves under the waves, or the bars, the bands between the different waters. All of these are observable. But you brought out some really interesting ones. The semen coming from the backbone and the ribs. Even today, children know that that's not where the semen comes from. And of course, these missiles that are flying across the heavens, supposedly driving away the devils, the demons, the shaitans who are sitting there trying to listen to the Quran. It's great imagery. It's certainly nice for bedtime reading for children, but it doesn't make much scientific sense. These are not miracles at all, are they?
No, not at all.
No. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
This has been excellent. We're going to do some more series on this. Come on back and help us realize that this book has a problem. It needs some type of authority. You can see why Muslims are trying to find anything to try to give it authority, because it's obviously everything they are dependent on comes from one book, this book. These seeming scientific miracles that they now have up on Al Jazeera television, they're not miracles at all. They're folk tales. Exciting folk tales. They're political tracts written by Miricles in 630. But they don't belong in the Word of God. Not with errors like that. God doesn't make that kind of mistake. Man does. Proving once again, the Quran is nothing more than a book from man, not from God. Come on home, because we've got the real book that doesn't have these problems. We know what the Bible says. Thank goodness we don't have to make these kind of excuses. Thanks again, John. It's great to have you. We'll see you back again. This is Jaden, over and out.